A poor mountain man found a tumor on his arm, but when it burst he couldn't believe his eyes. Out in the frozen Rockies he thought it was infection, a death sentence. Instead, inside his flesh was something shining, silver ore. A miracle? Or a curse? He rides into town, desperate for answers. But at the land office, his hope turns to fire. Another claim already filed, and a railroad agent waiting to snatch it all. And the shocking truth? The land doesn't even belong to either of them. It belongs by treaty to the Ute. Now this broken man, a widowed farm woman, and a tribal scout must decide: stand together or be crushed by the most powerful force in the West. What will happen when his wound becomes the spark for justice, family, and war against greed? And when the silver hidden in his arm draws enemies to his door, will it save them all or destroy everything he loves? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter mountain wind rattled the thin walls of Noel Boone's line shack as he stirred before dawn. His eyes opened to darkness save for the faint glow of dying embers in the fireplace. The cold had settled deep in his bones during the night, and his arm throbbed something fierce. Noel sat up on his thin mattress, running calloused fingers over the swollen lump that had been growing these past days. The touch made him wince. Heat radiated from the spot, and the skin felt tight as a drum. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, his breath visible in the frigid air. The larder situation wouldn't wait for his arm to heal. He'd been putting off a hunting trip, hoping the swelling would go down, but his food stores had dwindled to almost nothing. With winter's icy grip still holding firm in the high country, he couldn't risk running out of provisions. Noel pulled on his heavy wool shirt and buckskin jacket, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through his arm. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he made his way to the woodpile. He needed to get a proper fire going before heading out to check his trap lines. Taking up his axe, he positioned a log on the chopping block. The first swing sent needles of agony shooting from his forearm to shoulder. Noel gritted his teeth, determined to push through. By the time he had a decent pile of kindling split, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. Inside, he carefully built up the fire, adding smaller pieces until the flames caught proper. The warmth began to chase away the chill, but did nothing to ease the burning in his arm. If anything, it felt worse. He fixed himself a meager breakfast of the last handful of beans, warming them in a tin cup by the fire. The portion wasn't nearly enough to fuel a day of hunting, but it would have to do. His stores had run so low he could count what remained on one hand: 3 potatoes, half a sack of beans, and some dried meat that had seen better days. Strapping on his snowshoes, Noel headed out as the first gray light of dawn crept over the mountains. The fresh powder was deep, and breaking trail took all his concentration. Each step required careful placement to keep his balance. The exertion made his breath steam in the crisp morning air. He checked his trap lines methodically, working his way through the familiar circuit. The pain in his arm grew steadily worse, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. By midday, the swelling had increased noticeably, stretching the sleeve of his jacket tight. The traps yielded little, just one scrawny rabbit and a pine marten. It wasn't enough to see him through, not by half. Noel knew he needed to push on, try to track larger game, but his strength was failing. The throbbing in his arm had become nearly unbearable. The afternoon light was already fading when he finally turned back toward the cabin. Each step became a battle of will, his boots feeling heavier with every trudge through the snow. The wound sent waves of fire through his flesh, and a deep exhaustion settled into his bones. Noel barely made it through his cabin door before his legs gave out. He collapsed near the hearth, his kills falling forgotten from nerveless fingers. Working with trembling hands, he managed to get a fire going, though the simple task nearly drained what little energy he had left. The pain crescendoed, centered on the angry lump in his arm. Noel fumbled with his jacket buttons, then rolled up his sleeve. The swollen flesh had an angry red color that made his stomach turn. As he watched, The skin seemed to stretch and pulse. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered, transfixed by the grotesque sight. The pressure built until he thought he'd surely pass out. Then, with a sudden sharp pain that drew a gasp from his lips, the swelling burst. Noel steeled himself for the worst, expecting a gush of corruption. Instead, his eyes widened in disbelief. There, emerging from the split skin, was something solid, something that caught the firelight and threw it back with a metallic gleam. With shaking fingers, he carefully extracted a jagged shard about the size of his thumbnail. It was rock, but unlike any he'd seen before, shot through with threads of pure, glittering silver. Noel sat back against the rough cabin wall, cradling the piece in his palm. His mining days were long behind him, buried with so much else in that collapse, but he hadn't forgotten how to recognize good ore when he saw it. This was rich. Richer than anything he'd seen come out of the mines around these parts. "Lord above," he whispered, voice quavering. "What manner of sign is this?" The snow tapped softly against his window shutters, a gentle counterpoint to his racing thoughts. The pain in his arm had eased considerably, though the spot still burned. He found himself unable to look away from the glittering shard. Was this God's answer to his prayers for provision? Or was it something else? A warning, perhaps, or even a curse? The memory of the mine collapse that had nearly taken his life rose unbidden. He'd been pulled from those depths by what seemed like miracle alone, while others, including his own brother, hadn't been so blessed. The guilt of surviving still weighed heavy on his soul. Sleep eluded him entirely that night. He alternated between pacing the cabin's worn floorboards and sitting by the fire, turning the silver-shot rock over and over in his hands. The firelight caught each facet, sending sparkles dancing across the rough walls. Each time he set it down, he found himself picking it up again moments later, as if to assure himself it was real. By the time false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Noel had made his decision. He needed to know what this thing was worth, and that meant a trip into town. It had been months since he'd made that journey. He preferred the solitude of his mountain to the suspicious glances and whispered words that followed him through the streets. But there was no help for it now. He forced himself to eat a small supper of the beans he'd cooked that morning, though his stomach churned with anxiety. The meager meal did little to settle his nerves as he began gathering what he'd need for the ride down the mountain. His gaze kept returning to the ore piece, which he'd placed on the crude table where the lamplight could catch it. The silver threads seemed to pulse with an inner light of their own, drawing his eye like a lodestone draws iron. Was it truly a blessing? Or would it prove to be just another source of grief, like Santa the Cursed? Mine. Bean. Noel carefully wrapped the shard in a clean handkerchief and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Whatever this discovery meant, he'd find out soon enough. Come first light, he'd saddle his horse and make for town. The assayer's office would tell him if this piece was truly valuable, or if he was chasing fool's hopes again. He spent the remaining hours before dawn checking his gear and planning his route. The snow would make the journey treacherous, but he knew these mountains better than any man alive. If God had truly sent this sign, he reckoned he'd see him safely down to find out its meaning. The lamp burned low as Noel sat in his single chair, absently rubbing the spot where the silver had emerged. The wound had already begun to scab over, though it remained tender to the touch. Outside, the snow continued its gentle fall, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its mate. Come morning, he'd leave the familiar solitude of his mountain sanctuary and face whatever waited below. For now, he sat in the quiet darkness, alternating between prayer and wonder at the strange turn his life had taken. Dawn broke over the Colorado Rockies with all the warmth of a frozen iron skillet. Noel Boone stood in his cabin doorway, watching the pale light creep across fresh snow. The tobacco tin felt heavy in his coat pocket, its precious cargo safely wrapped in cloth. His fingers brushed the spot on his arm where the silver had emerged, now scabbed over, but still tender. Looks like another cold one, old friend, he muttered to Patch, his graying mule, who stood patiently in the yard. The animal's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as Noel carefully secured the saddle. His hands moved with practiced ease over the worn leather straps, checking each buckle twice. Patch had been his faithful companion for 8 years now, ever since the mining accident that changed everything. The memory rose unbidden, as sharp and cold as the morning air. The crack of timber supports giving way, the roar of falling rock, the absolute darkness as tons of earth buried him alive. For 3 days he'd lain trapped in that pitch-black tomb, certain each breath would be his last. When the rescue crew finally broke through, they called it a miracle. But Noel knew the real miracle was that he'd kept his sanity in that crushing darkness. He shook off the memories and mounted up. Patch's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they started down the mountain trail. The descent would take most of the day, following switchbacks through dense pine forest. Fresh powder had smoothed over the usual landmarks, forcing Noel to rely on his deep knowledge of the terrain. By midday, the sun had barely warmed the air. Noel's breath still frosted with each exhale, and his feet had gone numb despite his thick wool socks. The tobacco tin pressed against his chest like a secret weight. Every few hours he found himself patting his pocket, making sure it was still there. The short winter day was already fading when he spotted smoke rising from the chimney of Widow Carson's way station. The sight of the sturdy log building with its promising lamplight in the windows made his tired muscles ache with relief. Patch seemed to perk up too, picking up his pace as they approached. Martha Carson met him at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Her weathered face crinkled with surprise. "Well, if it ain't Noel Boone. Been an age since we've seen you down this way." "Evening, Ms. Carson. Got room for a tired traveler?" "Always do. Stew's hot, if you're hungry." She gestured him inside, where the warmth of the cooking fire made his cold, numbed cheeks tingle. The way station's common room was empty except for Martha and her husband Tom, who nodded a greeting from his chair by the fire. The smell of beef stew and fresh bread filled the air, making Noel's stomach growl. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until that moment. Martha ladled out a generous bowl and set it before him with a chunk of brown bread. As Noel ate, he carefully steered the conversation toward mining news, trying to sound casual. "Heard anything about new strikes in these parts?" Martha's expression turned grave as she settled into a chair across from him. "Had 3 fellows through here last week headed home with empty pockets. Said they'd spent everything they had chasing stories of silver up near Crystal Creek. Found nothing but fool's gold and frozen ground." She shook her head. "Seen too many good men lose everything to those mountains, chasing dreams of getting rich quick." Noel nodded, keeping his face neutral even as his hand strayed to the tin in his pocket. "Reckon that's so," he said quietly and turned his attention back to his stew. Later, lying in the hayloft with his saddle blanket pulled up against the cold, Noel listened to the creak and groan of freight wagons passing on the snow-packed road below. Each sound seemed to echo his doubts. Was he fooling himself? The silver shard felt real enough, but how many men had been ruined by following false hopes? Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by the rumble of passing wagons and his own circular thoughts. The accident that had nearly killed him had started with similar dreams of silver. His brother had followed those dreams to his death, leaving behind a widow and children Noel hadn't faced in years. The guilt of that still gnawed at him. Before first light, Noel was already up and moving. He thanked Martha for her hospitality, pressed a few coins into her hand, and led Patch back onto the trail. The mule's hooves slipped occasionally on the icy switchbacks, but the sure-footed animal kept them steady as they descended the final stretch toward town. The sun was well up. When they encountered the first signs of civilization, a crew of loggers headed out to the timber camps, their axes gleaming dully in the morning light. Noel touched the brim of his hat as they passed, receiving quiet nods in return. Their eyes held the usual mix of curiosity and wariness that he'd grown used to over the years. The town of Silver Creek spread out below them, more ghost than settlement in the winter morning. Smoke rose straight up from chimneys in the still air, and the main street lay empty, except for a few hardy souls hurrying between buildings. As Noel rode in, he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from behind frost-covered windows. He knew what they saw. Poor, solitary Boone, the mountain hermit who'd survived the cave-in only to withdraw from the world. The land office sat squat and official near the center of town, its weather-beaten sign promising claims, deeds, and assays. Noel dismounted stiffly and tied Patch to the hitching post, taking longer than necessary with the reins. His fingers found the tobacco tin one last time, confirming its presence. For a long moment he stood on the wooden sidewalk staring at the door. Beyond it lay answers he wasn't sure he wanted. The silver shard could be worthless, nothing but another false hope. Or worse, it could be valuable enough to draw attention, to drag him back into a world he'd fled years ago. But he'd come too far to turn back now. Drawing a deep breath of the frozen air, Noel squared his shoulders and pushed through the door into whatever waited on the other side. The land office's warmth hit Noel like a wall after the bitter cold outside. Wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove mixed with the familiar scents of ink, paper, and dust. Behind a scarred oak counter, the clerk, old Walter Mills, peered at him through wire-rimmed spectacles, his quill paused mid-stroke. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man himself," Walter said, setting down his pen. "What brings you down from your perch, Mr. Boone?" Noel's fingers trembled slightly as he drew out the tobacco tin. The other men in the office, two farmers discussing boundary stakes, fell silent, watching. Noel was conscious of his worn coat, his trail-dusty boots, the wild look about him that came from too many seasons alone. "Got something needs testing, Walter," he said quietly, unwrapping the cloth to reveal the silver shard. It caught the morning light streaming through the window, throwing bright reflections across the office walls. Walter's eyebrows lifted. He reached for his testing kit with practiced hands, laying out small bottles of acid and a scratch stone. "Where'd this come from?" he asked, examining the piece through a jeweler's loupe. "Rather not say just yet," Noel replied, watching intently as Walter applied a drop of acid to the stone's surface. The liquid sizzled, leaving a telltale mark that made the clerk's eyes widen. "Pure silver," Walter announced, looking up at Noel with new respect. "High grade too, I'd warrant. You're sitting on something valuable, friend." Hope expanded in Noel's chest like a warm sunrise. After years of scraping by, of lonely winters and empty larders, here was God's provision, strange as the delivery had been. He reached for the claim forms Walter was already pulling out. The office door banged open, letting in a blast of cold air and a familiar figure that stopped Noel's heart mid-beat. Kim Boone stood in the doorway, her thin wool coat dusted with snow, her dark hair streaked with early gray. His brother's widow. The woman he hadn't faced in 5 long years. She froze when she saw him, color draining from her face. "Noel?" she whispered, like she was seeing a ghost. "They said you died in the mountains." "Kim." His voice came out rough. She looked older, worn down by the years of working her failing farm alone. The guilt he'd carried since his brother's death grew heavier. "I need to file a claim," she announced to Walter, deliberately turning away from Noel. "The bank's threatening foreclosure on the farm. There's copper on my south acres. It's my only chance." Walter spread out a map, marking the boundaries as Kim described them. Noel's stomach knotted as he watched the clerk's pencil move. He knew that land. It lay just below where he'd found his silver. "Ma'am," Walter said slowly, "I'm afraid these boundaries overlap with the claim Mr. Boone was just filing." "What?" Kim's eyes flashed to Noel. "You disappear for 5 years, let's leave us to struggle alone, and now you show up to take the only thing that might save my children?" "I didn't know," Noel started, but Kim cut him off. "Where were you?" Her voice cracked. "When Tom was dying in the mine collapse, when we needed you most, where were you, Noel Boone?" The old pain surged up, memories of being trapped in his own cave-in, unable to help when his brother needed him. "I couldn't," he began. "Couldn't what? Couldn't face us? Couldn't bear your guilt?" Angry tears sparkled in her eyes. "My children are eating nothing but beans and bread. The bank's ready to take everything we have. And you show up now?" Walter cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Folks, there's another matter you should know about. The railroad's been sniffing around those parcels. They're claiming the whole area for a new spur line." Noel felt the weight of the silver shard in his pocket. He looked at Kim's proud, desperate face and made his decision. "I'll withdraw my claim." The door burst open again, this time admitting a man in an expensive Eastern suit. His polished boots clicked on the wooden floor as he strode to the counter. "I'm afraid neither claim will be necessary," he announced, pulling out a sheaf of papers. "I represent the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company. These lands are already spoken for under an 1858 treaty with the Ute Nation." "What treaty?" Kim demanded. The railroad lawyer's smile never reached his eyes. "One that predates any homestead claims in the territory. The railroad has purchased all tribal rights and interests." He laid the documents on the counter. "I suggest you both save yourselves the filing fees. Good day." The door closed behind him with terrible finality. In the silence that followed, Noel and Kim stared at each other across the office. 5 years of distance and hurt stretched between them, but now they faced a common enemy. Walter shuffled through the treaty papers, frowning. "He's right about one thing, this complicates everything. Railroads got judges in their pocket. They'll fight any claim you file." Kim's shoulders sagged. Noel saw the defeat in her stance, and something stirred in him, the protective instinct that had once bound their family together. "What if we fought it?" he asked quietly. "Together?" Kim's eyes met his, wary, but considering. The railroad lawyer's arrogance had kindled an anger in her that temporarily overshadowed her bitterness toward Noel. "The children need that land," she said finally. "I can't give up without trying." Noel nodded, understanding the steel in her voice. He turned to Walter. "File both claims," he said. "We'll sort out the boundaries later." "You're asking for trouble," Walter warned, but he reached for his pen. "Railroad won't take kindly to opposition." "Already got trouble," Noel replied, watching Kim's face. A silent communication passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. They had wounded each other through absence and abandonment, but now a greater threat loomed. The morning light slanted through the office windows, catching the silver shard still lying on the counter. Its gleam seemed dimmer now, weighted with complications Noel hadn't imagined when he'd first discovered it in his arm. But as he watched Kim sign her name with determined strokes, he felt the first stirring of purpose he'd known in years. The railroad lawyer's boots could be heard clicking away down the boardwalk outside. Kim gathered her worn shawl closer, avoiding Noel's gaze as she prepared to leave. The wall between them remained built of grief and missed chances, but perhaps they had found a reason to begin dismantling it, one painful stone at a time. The boarding house creaked and settled in the gathering dark as Noel sat alone at the long wooden table. His spoon scraped against the bottom of a bowl filled with thin beef stew. The dining room stood empty except for him, most other lodgers having finished their suppers hours ago. A coal oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the faded wallpaper. Outside, snow fell steadily, muffling the occasional sounds of wagon wheels and horses' hooves passing on the street. Noel's thoughts kept circling back to Kim's face in the land office, the gray streaks in her hair, the deep tiredness around her eyes, the way anger had sparked life into her features when she'd confronted him. 5 years. Had it really been that long? The time had blurred together in his mountain solitude, seasons bleeding one into the next as he'd hidden from his guilt and grief. But Kim's appearance had torn open old wounds he'd thought long scarred over. Mrs. Potter, the boarding house owner, appeared at his elbow to clear away his bowl. "Anything else you need, Mr. Boone?" "No, ma'am. Much obliged." His voice sounded rusty from disuse. "Been a long while since we've seen you in town," she commented, wiping down the table with practiced strokes. "Most folks reckoned you'd passed on up there in them mountains." Noel shifted uncomfortably. Reckon I might as well have been? Mrs. Potter clucked her tongue. That's no way to talk. Lord gives us each day for a purpose. She gathered up the dishes and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Noel alone with his thoughts again. He pulled out the silver shard, turning it over in his calloused hands. The lamplight caught its edges, making them gleam. What purpose could there be in this strange gift, emerging from his own flesh? And why now, when Kim and her children needed help most? Sleep came fitfully that night in the narrow boarding house bed. Noel dreamed of cave-ins and falling rocks, of his brother's voice calling his name, of Kim's accusing eyes. Morning light found him already dressed and headed down to breakfast, his boots quiet on the wooden stairs. The dining room smelled of coffee and frying bacon. He had just settled at an empty table when the front door opened, letting in a blast of cold air. And Kim. She stood in the doorway, snowflakes melting in her hair, looking as surprised to see him as he was to see her. For a moment, neither moved. Then she glanced around the room at the other occupied tables and sighed. Nowhere else to sit, she said stiffly, moving to take the chair opposite him. Don't suppose you mind? Noel shook his head, watching as she unwound her worn shawl. In the morning light, the signs of hardship were even clearer on her face, the deep worry lines, the shadows under her eyes. Mrs. Potter bustled over with coffee and plates of eggs and bacon. Why, Mrs. Boone, didn't expect to see you in town this morning. How are those young ones of yours? Managing, Kim said shortly, her hands curling around the warm coffee cup. Thank you, Mrs. Potter. They ate in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the scrape of forks and the murmur of conversation from nearby tables. Noel couldn't help noticing how Kim ate carefully, like someone used to making food stretch. Did you hear about the Hendersons? A loud voice carried from the next table. Railroads claiming their grazing land too. Sent men out yesterday to survey for the track. Kim's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Another voice joined in. Heard they're pushing clear through to the Miller place. Don't matter none if folks been there 20 years. Railroad says that treaty gives them right-of-way clean. Across the valley. Children keep asking if we'll lose the farm. Kim's voice was so quiet Noel almost missed it. When he looked up, her eyes were fixed on her plate. I tell them not to worry, but... She swallowed hard. We barely made it through last winter. If we lose the land now... The unfinished sentence hung between them. Noel thought of the thin faces of Kim's children. He'd glimpsed them sometimes from afar when he'd ventured near town. The youngest wouldn't even remember him. That lawyer, he said slowly. He seemed mighty sure about that treaty. Too sure. Kim's jaw tightened, like he knew no one would challenge it. Noel pushed his eggs around his plate, thinking. Might be someone who knows the truth of it, someone who'd remember a treaty that old. The Utes. Kim set down her coffee cup. But they're not likely to help us. After everything that's happened, might be our only chance. Noel hesitated, then added, Reckon we could ask Reverend Sims first. He's been here longest. Might know something about it. Kim studied him for a long moment, weighing his suggestion. Finally, she nodded. He holds morning services. We could catch him before he rides his circuit. They found Reverend Sims in his small church, carefully wrapping communion bread in clean cloth. Morning light streamed through colored glass windows, casting rainbow patterns on the wooden floor. The preacher looked up as they entered, surprise crossing his weathered face. Well now, he said, setting aside his work. This is an unexpected pair. Reverend. Kim stepped forward. We need your counsel about something. They explained about the overlapping claims, the railroad lawyer, the supposed treaty. As they spoke, the preacher's expression grew troubled. He moved to his desk and began rifling through papers. I remember something about this, he said, pulling out a yellowed newspaper. Here, 1858. There was a treaty signed right enough, but the terms, He squinted at the faded print. They're not what that railroad man claims. The Utes never sold their rights completely. So the railroad's lying? Kim leaned forward eagerly. Not lying exactly? Reverend Sims removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. More like twisting the truth to serve their purpose. But the Ute elders would know the real terms. They keep their histories carefully. The agency's a day's ride, Noel said, through rough country. The children, Kim began. Mrs. Potter can look in on them, Reverend Sims offered. If you're really meaning to do this. Kim's hands twisted in her shawl. What choice do we have? The railroad will take everything if we don't fight. The preacher nodded slowly. Then I'll pray for your success. And he hesitated. I'll pray this journey helps heal other wounds as well. They left the church in silence, each lost in thought. The winter sun had climbed higher, making the snow gleam blindingly bright. In the street, people hurried past, casting curious glances at the unlikely pair. I'll need an hour to arrange things for the children, Kim said finally. Meet at the livery stable? Noel nodded, watching her stride away through the snow. Her back was straight, her steps determined, despite the visible mending in her skirts and the thin soles of her boots. The afternoon found them riding side by side along a narrow trail, their horses picking their way carefully through patches of ice and snow. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks lost in gray clouds. Neither spoke much, each wrapped in their own thoughts and memories. As dusk approached, they topped a rise and saw the agency buildings spread out below them, square wooden structures flying the American flag, smoke rising from chimneys into the darkening sky. A handful of soldiers stood guard at the gates, their blue uniforms stark against the snow. Kim drew her horse to a halt, studying the scene. Do you think they'll help us? Don't know. Noel shifted in his saddle, feeling the weight of the silver shard in his pocket. But we've come too far to turn back now. Together, they rode down toward the agency gates. The flag snapped in the cold wind above them as they dismounted, their boots crunching in the snow. The soldiers watched their approach with wary eyes, hands resting casually on their weapons. Noel felt the tension in the air. Decades of broken promises, blood shed on both sides, trust shattered and rebuilt a dozen times over. He glanced at Kim, saw the same awareness in her face. Whatever came next would depend on finding common ground with people who had every reason to turn them away. The agency buildings cast long shadows in the fading light. Somewhere beyond them, the reservation stretched away into gathering darkness, holding the answers they desperately needed. If they could only convince the Utes to share them. The agency guard studied their papers with narrowed eyes. Business? Need to speak with someone about the Treaty of 1858, Noel said, keeping his voice steady. The guard grunted, jerking his head toward a weathered building. Indian agent's office is there, but he won't be back till I can help them. The new voice came from behind them. A young Ute man stepped forward, dressed in buckskins with an Army Scout's badge pinned to his vest. His black hair was tied back neatly, and he carried himself with quiet dignity. Recognition flickered in his dark eyes as he looked at Noel. The mountain man. I remember you from 3 winters ago. You traded medicines when fever struck our camp. Noel nodded slowly. Henry, ain't it? Yes. Henry's gaze shifted to Kim, inclining his head respectfully. I am Scout here. You have questions about the treaty? Kim stepped forward. The railroad claims it gives them rights to our land. They're trying to force us out. Something hardened in Henry's expression. Come, this is not talk for the gate. He led them past the agency buildings to where several cooking fires burned. Elderly Utes sat wrapped in blankets, watching silently as Henry gestured for Noel and Kim to sit on log benches. From a pot hanging over the flames, he ladled out portions of venison stew into tin cups. Eat first, he said, passing them the cups. Then, we talk. The meat was tender, seasoned with wild herbs. Kim ate carefully, conscious of the eyes watching them. Noel noticed how she savored each bite, like someone who hadn't tasted fresh meat in too long. When they finished, Henry settled across from them, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "The treaty you ask about? I know it well. My grandfather was there when it was signed. The railroad twists its meaning." "How so?" Noel asked. Henry picked up a stick, drawing lines in the dirt. "The treaty gave right of passage through certain valleys. Narrow paths marked by stone cairns, but the railroad claims it means all land everywhere." His mouth tightened. "They pressure agents, judges, make promises, threats. Papers disappear. New ones appear with different words." "We've seen it," Kim said softly. "Good people losing everything they built." "Your people have lost much too," Noel added, watching Henry carefully. Henry nodded, his eyes on the fire. "This is why I suggest partnership." "Partnership?" Kim leaned forward. "Alone, we fight and lose. You will lose your farms. We will lose more land. But together..." Henry drew more lines, connecting them. "Together we can prove the railroad lies. I have copies of the true treaty, hidden where they cannot find them, and I have seen their men break laws, hurt people who resist. Ain't exactly safe going against the railroad," Noel said. "No." Henry's gaze was steady. "But is it safe to let them win? To watch your widow sister's children starve? To see my people pushed into smaller and smaller spaces until nothing remains?" Noel rubbed his scarred arm unconsciously. Kim noticed the gesture, her expression softening. "He's right," she said. "We need allies. And the Utes have more right to this land than any of us." The elderly Utes around the fire watched this exchange with unblinking eyes. One woman nodded slowly, speaking in her own language. Henry listened to Sardis then translated. "She says the land remembers who honors it, who protects it." He paused. "She says your hearts seem true, even if your skins are pale." The sun had set fully now, stars pricking through the darkening sky. Henry added wood to the fire, sending sparks swirling upward. "Stay tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we can speak more of plans. The agent will return. He is a fair man when not pressed by railroad money. He will listen." They made camp at the edge of the agency grounds where the fence met open prairie. Henry brought them extra blankets and more stew, refusing payment. "My people know hunger," he said simply. "We do not let others go without food when we have some to share." After he left, Kim and Noel sat quiet by their small fire. The night was clear and cold, coyotes calling in the distance. From the agency buildings came the soft sound of singing, Ute women's voices rising and falling in ancient melodies. "The children pray every night," Kim said suddenly, "for food, for warm clothes, for God to help us keep the farm." She pulled her shawl tighter. "I tell them he's listening, but sometimes it's hard to believe," Noel finished softly. "Yes." She looked at him across the flames. "Like that silver in your arm. Curse or miracle? Either way, it brought you here. Made you listen to Henry." Noel touched his arm where the shard had emerged. The skin was still tender, but the wound was healing clean. He thought about what she'd said, about prayers and provisions, about God's strange ways of answering. "Reckon if it is a miracle," he said slowly, "maybe it ain't just about getting rich. Maybe it's about something bigger. Justice, like Henry said." Kim nodded, adding a stick to the fire. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient paths, watching over Indian and settler alike. In the morning, they would begin planning their stand against the railroad's greed. But for now, they sat in almost comfortable silence, sharing warmth in the first, fragile threads of trust. Around them, the prairie stretched vast and dark. From the agency came the soft thud of a drum, keeping time with the women's songs. The sound seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the land itself, a rhythm that had echoed here long before treaties or railroads, and would continue long after. Noel shifted his blanket, watching the flames dance. His arm ached dully, reminding him of the silver's strange emergence. Kim was right. It had led him here to this unlikely alliance with his brother's widow and a proud young Ute scout. Perhaps the pain that had driven him up the mountain wasn't a curse after all, but a summons to something larger than himself. The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks. Kim had fallen silent, her face thoughtful in the flickering light. Nearby, a nightbird called, answered by another far across the prairie. The stars continued their slow dance overhead, while below, two lonely people and their newfound ally rested on the edge of change. Dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle brushstrokes of pink and gold. Frost sparkled on the prairie grass as three riders set out from the agency, Noel on his mule patch, Kim on her bay mare, and Henry astride his pinto pony. The morning air bit sharp and clean, their breath forming clouds in the stillness. They rode at an easy pace, Henry leading them along paths that avoided the main roads. Better not to be seen too much, he explained, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. Railroad men watch the trails these days. Kim nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. My farm's just past Willow Creek. We can rest the horses there. Noel noticed how she sat straight in the saddle despite her weariness. The same strength he remembered in his brother shone in her now, that stubborn refusal to bend even when times turned hard. The sun climbed higher as they crossed the creek and followed the fence line to Kim's homestead. It was a modest place, a weather-beaten cabin, a small barn, and fields lying fallow under winter's grip. But smoke rose cheerfully from the chimney, and three small figures burst from the cabin door at the sound of hoofbeats. "Mama! Mama's home!" The children raced across the yard, their faces bright with joy, despite their worn clothes. The eldest boy, about 12, reached them first, helping Kim dismount. His younger brother, perhaps 9, and their little sister, no more than 6, crowded close behind. "Children," Kim said, embracing them. "This here's your Uncle Noel, your pa's brother. And this is Henry, a friend who's going to help us." The children stared at Noel with frank curiosity. He shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, unused to such direct attention. But the little girl's smile, missing 2 front teeth, tugged at something long buried in his heart. "Uncle Noel?" The eldest boy stepped forward. "I'm James. Pa used to talk about you sometimes." Noel swallowed hard. "That so? Said you could track anything that walked or crawled?" James glanced at the rifle in Noel's saddle scabbard. "Said you were the best shot in 3 territories." "Your pa was always given to tall tales," Noel said gruffly, but his eyes softened. Henry dismounted smoothly, drawing James's attention. The boy's eyes widened at the scout's buckskins and quiet dignity. "You're Indian?" "A real Indian?" "Ute," Henry corrected gently. "My people have lived in these mountains since before the first horse came." "Could you teach me to track deer?" James asked eagerly. "We ain't had fresh meat in—" "James," Kim cut in, "mind your manners. Our guests need to rest their horses." They led the animals to the barn, where the younger boy, William, proudly showed them the stalls he'd mucked out. The little girl, Sarah, danced around them, chattering about the new calf expected in spring. After settling the horses, Noel noticed a broken section of fence near the vegetable patch. Without being asked, he gathered tools from the barn and set to work. The familiar rhythm of physical labor helped ease the strange tension in his chest, a mixture of grief, guilt, and something warmer he couldn't name. In the adjacent field, Henry walked with James, pointing out deer signs in the frozen earth. The boy listened intently, absorbing every word about tracks and trails, wind direction, and animal habits. His eagerness reminded Noel of another boy long ago, learning similar lessons from their father. Near midday, Kim called them in for a meal. The cabin was small but neat, warmed by the cook stove where she'd made cornbread. She served it with obvious embarrassment at having nothing more to offer. "It's fresh baked," she said, cutting careful portions. "We still had some meal left." "It's good," Noel said firmly, recognizing the pride that made it hard to accept charity. He'd felt it himself often enough, up in his line shack. The children ate quickly but politely, having clearly been taught manners despite their hardship. Sarah kept stealing glances at Noel until finally she gathered her courage. "Uncle Noel? Mama says you live all alone up the mountain. Don't you get scared?" "Sarah," Kim chided, but Noel shook his head. "It's all right." He considered the question seriously. "Reckon I got used to it, but sometimes it does get mighty quiet up there." "We got scripture readings every night," Sarah offered. "You could stay and listen." The invitation, so innocent and unexpected, caught Noel off guard. He looked at Kim, who was suddenly very busy with the cornbread. "That's kind of you, little miss," he managed. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Noel finished mending the fence while Henry showed James and William how to set snares for rabbits. Kim worked in her small kitchen garden, Sarah helping by picking up frozen vegetables and asking endless questions. As evening approached, Henry gathered them around the kitchen table, spreading out a rough map he'd drawn. "We need allies," he said, marking locations with a piece of charcoal. "Farmers here and here, miners who've lost claims, townspeople tired of railroad bullying. Ain't gonna be easy," Noel said. "Railroads got money and law behind them." "They think they do," Henry corrected. "But truth is stronger than paper laws if we can prove it." Kim leaned forward, tracing the map with work-roughened fingers. "The Reverend Sims might help. He's been speaking against the railroad's greed." "And Matt Turner," Noel added reluctantly. "Used to work their surveying crew till they cheated him too." Henry nodded approvingly. "Each person we convince makes us stronger." Before they could discuss more, Sarah tugged at Kim's sleeve. "Mama, it's time for scripture." Kim glanced at their guests. "You're welcome to join us." Henry declined politely, saying he needed to check his horse, but Noel found himself nodding. The children quickly arranged themselves on the floor near the cook stove, where a lamp cast warm light in the gathering dusk. Kim handed Noel a worn Bible, its pages soft with use. "Would you read for us?" He took it carefully, suddenly conscious of his calloused hands. How long had it been since he'd held the good book? Not since before the mine collapse, surely. Before his brother's death, when grief and guilt had driven him into solitude. Sarah scooted closer to him as he opened to the passage Kim indicated. His voice, rough at first, steadied as he read, "Be strong and of good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord thy God, he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee." The word stirred something deep inside him. Memories of his mother reading by lamplight, of his brother's quiet faith even in hardship. He looked up to find Sarah watching him with solemn eyes. "That's my favorite part," she whispered. "About being brave." After the reading, Kim served a simple supper of beans and the last of the cornbread. The children's laughter filled the small cabin as they told Henry and Noel about their daily adventures. William's battle with a determined raccoon, James's progress in school, Sarah's plans for the garden, come spring. When darkness fell fully, Kim made up pallets for the children while Henry took first watch outside. Noel climbed to the barn loft where he would sleep, carrying the memory of Sarah's gap-toothed smile and James's eager questions. Through the cracks in the barn boards, he could see lamplight from the cabin windows. The sound of children's voices drifted up, their evening prayers then quiet giggles as Kim shooed them to bed. Such ordinary sounds, yet they filled a hollow place in his heart he hadn't known was empty. He thought of the silver shard that had brought him here, still safely wrapped in his saddlebag. The pain of its emergence seemed distant now, overshadowed by newer sensations. The warmth of family, the stirring of long dormant faith, the first tentative bonds of belonging. Settling onto the hay, Noel listened to the night sounds of the farm, horses shifting below, wind in the eaves, the children's muffled laughter. For the first time since his brother's death, he felt something like peace. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight, surrounded by the simple music of family life, he could almost believe in miracles again. His arm ached faintly where the silver had emerged, but the pain felt different now. Not a curse or a burden, but a reminder that God's purposes often worked in mysterious ways, that sometimes the path home led through unexpected territory. In the barn below, a horse nickered softly. The children's voices gradually quieted. Noel pulled his blanket closer, feeling the first real warmth of belonging he'd known in years. Sleep came easier than usual, watched over by stars that winked through gaps in the roof boards, and the silent prayers of those who dreamed in the cabin nearby. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as 3 riders made their way down the mountain trail toward town. Noel rode his mule patch while Kim and Henry followed on their horses. The morning air held winter's bite, their breath forming clouds in the chill. "Saloon's our first stop," Noel said, adjusting his worn hat. "Miners will be there, even this early. They work night shift at the Silver Queen." Kim pulled her shawl tighter. "Are you certain that's appropriate?" "They need to hear from all of us," Henry said quietly. "Even those who might not expect to see a woman or a ute in their morning whiskey." The town was stirring to life as they rode in. Shopkeepers swept their boardwalks, and the smithy's forge already glowed orange. A few people stopped to stare at the unlikely trio, but Noel kept his eyes forward, guiding them to the hitching post outside the Bull's Head Saloon. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke and the sour smell of stale beer. A handful of miners hunched over tables, still dusty from their shift. They looked up as the door opened, conversations dying at the sight of Henry and Kim. Noel spotted Jake Miller, an old-timer he'd worked with before the accident. He led the others to his table. "Morning, Jake. Mind if we sit?" Jake's weathered face creased. "Boone? Ain't seen you in an age." His eyes flickered to Henry and Kim. "Interesting company you're keeping." "We need to talk," Noel said, pulling up chairs. "About the railroad. About fair treatment." Over the next hour, they listened to the miners' grievances. Pay cuts disguised as equipment fees, claims suddenly disputed, safety concerns ignored. Jake's knuckles whitened around his glass as he spoke. "They dock our pay if we don't make quota," a younger miner called Peterson added. "Don't matter if the timber's rotting or the shaft's flooding." "The treaty gives us grounds to challenge them," Henry explained, keeping his voice low and steady. "If we stand together." Some miners nodded, but others shifted uneasily. Peterson glanced toward the door. "Railroads got long arms. Man speaks up, he might find himself without work, or worse." "We're gathering tonight," Kim said, "at the church. To plan proper action, legal-like. Will you come?" Jake studied his empty glass. "Might be some of us will. Can't promise more than that." They left the saloon. As more townspeople filled the streets, their next stop was Thompson's General Store, where farmers often gathered to trade news and supplies. The bell jingled as they entered, and Mrs. Thompson looked up from her ledger. "Oh my," she said, blinking at the sight of them. "Can I help you folks?" Before they could answer, Ben Whitaker stormed in, his face red with frustration. "Another rate hike," he announced to no one in particular. 3 cents more per bushel to ship grain. Might as well give the whole harvest to the railroad and be done with it." "That's why we're here, Mr. Whitaker," Kim said. "We're gathering folk who've had enough." While Henry explained about the treaty and their plans, Noel noticed other customers lingering, pretending to examine goods while listening intently. Mrs. Thompson herself moved closer, absently straightening the same shelf of canned goods several times. "Church basement, you say?" Whitaker rubbed his chin. My Annie's been after me to attend services anyway. Their final stop was the small white church on the edge of town. They found Reverend Sims in his study, surrounded by papers and looking troubled. He welcomed them in, though his eyes kept straying to Henry with a mix of curiosity and shame. "I've been expecting someone to come," he said, settling behind his desk. "Ever since the railroad started pressing harder on land claims." "We need your help, Reverend," Kim said. "Your voice carries weight in town." The preacher's shoulders slumped. "Does it? When I stayed silent before, accepting railroad donations while good people lost their homes?" He stood and paced to the window. "I have much to atone for." "The good book speaks of redemption," Noel said quietly, surprising himself. "Reckon that's what we're all seeking one way or another." Sims turned back, something like hope lighting his tired face. Yes, perhaps you're right." He straightened his collar. "The church basement is yours tonight. I'll send word to those I trust." As evening approached, people began arriving in ones and twos. They came quietly, some looking over their shoulders, others trying to appear casual. Noel watched from the church steps as Jake led a group of miners round the back. Whitaker brought 3 other farmers. Mrs. Thompson slipped in through the side door. The basement was cold but dry, lit by oil lamps that cast long shadows on the whitewashed walls. Wooden chairs scraped on the floor as people settled in. Noel counted nearly 20 faces, more than he'd dared hope for. Reverend Sims opened with a prayer for guidance and justice. Then Kim stood, her voice soft but clear in the hushed room. "We all know why we're here," she began. "The railroad's been taking and taking, thinking we're too weak or scared to fight back. But we have something they don't expect." She gestured to Henry. "We have truth on our side." Henry unrolled the treaty copy on a table where everyone could see. "This land was promised to my people," he said. "The railroad's claims violate not just Ute rights, but all our rights. They think they can ignore the law when it suits them." Questions came from the crowd. Would they face violence? Could they afford lawyers? What about their jobs, their families? Noel stood then, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "I found silver up on my claim," he said. "Pure as anything. But I'm willing to risk losing it, because some things matter more than silver. Like justice, like keeping our word, even to those some folks want to forget." A murmur ran through the Gantakindasabi. They all knew what silver meant in these parts, the difference between feast and famine, between staying and leaving. "Zadresire." Ms. Thompson raised her hand. "I can pass messages through the store. Railroad men don't pay much mind to women's gossip. My boys can ride out to the outlying farms," Whitaker offered. "Spread the word quiet-like." One by one, people spoke up, offering what help they could. The miners would document safety violations. The farmers would band together on shipping rates. Reverend Sims would continue hosting meetings, disguised as prayer circles. They closed with another prayer, this one feeling more like a battle cry than a benediction. As people filed out into the night, Noel felt a fierce hope burning in his chest. These weren't warriors or politicians, just ordinary folk standing up for what was right. Outside, the night air carried the first hint of spring thaw. Stars wheeled overhead, bright and clean in the mountain sky. But the moment of triumph faded as they reached the hitching rail. 2 men lounged there, railroad company badges glinting on their vests. They didn't speak, just watched with cold eyes as the townspeople hurried past. One tapped his fingers meaningfully on his gun belt. Kim straightened her spine, walking past them with her head high. Henry followed, his face a mask of dignity. Noel brought up the rear, forcing himself not to reach for the knife in his boot. The railroad men made no move to stop them, but their message was clear. They were watching, and they weren't afraid to show it. As they mounted up, Noel heard one of the men spit in the dirt. The sound carried in the quiet night, like a promise of trouble to come. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Colorado mountains. Noel adjusted his borrowed suit jacket, stiff cotton scratching at his neck. The courthouse steps loomed before him, weathered stone worn smooth by decades of boots. Around him, wagons and riders filled the muddy street, drawn by word of the hearing. "Quite a crowd," Kim murmured, smoothing her best dress. Her children stood neat and pressed beside her, the youngest clutching a worn Bible. Henry rode up on his paint horse, wearing traditional Ute garments with a white man's coat. The sight drew stares from passers-by, but he sat tall in the saddle, treaty papers secure in his saddlebag. "The agent tried to stop me leaving the reservation," Henry said quietly as he dismounted. "Said it wasn't proper for me to speak in court." "Proper ain't always right," Noel replied, helping Kim's children down from their wagon. More allies arrived, Jake and his miners, still coal-dusted from the morning shift, Ben Whitaker, and 3 other farmers. Mrs. Thompson closed her store early, bringing fresh-baked bread to share. Reverend Sims arrived last, carrying a stack of documents. "Railroad men been asking questions," the preacher warned, passing around the bread. "Making threats, some say." "Let them," Kim said, though her hands trembled slightly as she straightened her son's collar. "We have truth on our side." The courthouse bell tolled 10 times, echoing off the mountains. People began filing inside, boots squeaking on the polished wooden floors. The high-ceilinged room smelled of pine soap and anxiety. Noel's group took seats near the front, behind the scarred oak table where they would present their case. Across the aisle, railroad men filled 3 rows, their suits dark and expensive. The company lawyer sat alone at his table, arranging papers with manicured hands. Judge Harrison entered, his black robe swishing. The room rose, then settled into tense silence as he adjusted his spectacles. "Railroad land claim hearing now in session," the clerk announced, voice carrying to the crowded gallery. The railroad lawyer rose first, smooth as cream. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of progress. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad has legal right to expand through these territories. He paused, lip curling. "Individual claims are merely attempts to extort compensation." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The lawyer continued, citing precedents, agreements, development needs. He spoke of manifest destiny and civilization's march, painting opponents as backwards, selfish. "And now, they drag in a reservation Indian," he gestured dismissively at Henry, "to muddy the waters with ancient grievances. I ask the court to dismiss these spurious claims and let progress continue unimpeded." Judge Harrison's expression remained neutral. "We'll hear from the other parties now." Henry stood first, unfolding the treaty with careful hands. Sunlight through tall windows illuminated the faded ink as he began to read. "This solemn agreement between the United States government and the Ute people, signed in good faith 1868, guarantees these lands to remain under Ute protection and habitation in perpetuity." His clear voice filled the hushed room. He read without drama or accusation, letting the words speak their truth. Even the railroad men shifted uncomfortably as the treaty's promises emerged in plain language. When Henry finished, he added quietly, "My people have kept our word. We ask only that others keep theirs." Kim rose next, hands clasped to still their shaking. "Your Honor, I ain't got fancy words. But that farm was my husband's dream, his legacy to our children. We work hard, pay our taxes, grow food that feeds this town. Railroad men say they'll pay fair price, but there ain't no price fair enough for a family's home." She spoke of midnight worries over thin harvests, of children's prayers for daily bread, of community bonds stronger than steel rails. Her voice gained strength as she continued, pride overcoming fear. "We ain't against progress, Your Honor. But progress that crushes poor folks ain't progress at all, it's just greed wearing a finer coat." The railroad lawyer smirked, but several townspeople nodded. Judge Harrison made notes on his paper. Noel stood last, conscious of his ill-fitting suit. He drew out the silver shard, holding it up to catch the light. "This came out of my arm, Your Honor. Been in there since a mine collapse 4 years back. Doctor said it was a miracle I survived. He set the shard on the judge's desk. Found it same day I learned about Kim's claim and the treaty. Some might call that coincidence. I call it providence. The room stayed silent as Noel described his solitary life, his brother's death where I sobbed the weight of guilt and grief. He spoke of Henry's dignity and Kim's courage, of miners risking jobs to speak truth, of a community coming together. That silver could make me rich, he finished. But there's things worth more than silver. Justice, honor, family. Reckon that's what we're really fighting for here. The railroad lawyer rose to object, but Judge Harrison waved him down. The old judge removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly as he considered. Minutes stretched like hours. Kim's youngest daughter leaned against Noel's arm, tired from sitting still. Henry remained straight-backed, eyes forward. The gallery hardly breathed. At last, Judge Harrison spoke. The law exists to serve justice, not merely progress. These matters, treaty rights, homestead claims, mineral rights, deserve proper consideration. He replaced his spectacles. I hereby delay any railroad action pending full review by territorial authorities in Washington. Court adjourned. The gavel crack was lost in sudden noise. People cheered, hugged, shook hands across the aisle. The railroad lawyer stalked out, face thunderous. Kim's children jumped up and down, caught in the general joy. We won? Kim's eldest boy asked, eyes wide. For now, Henry said, carefully refolding the treaty. But the fight isn't over. Outside, autumn sunlight bathed the courthouse steps in gold. Townspeople lingered, sharing Mrs. Thompson's bread, discussing next steps. Reverend Sims led a prayer of thanksgiving. Even the miners smiled, despite knowing they faced hard days ahead. Kim touched Noel's sleeve lightly. Thank you, she said, for standing with us. He nodded, struck by the softness in her eyes, the first warm look she'd given him since his brother's death. Reckon it's what family does. They loaded the children into the wagon as shadows lengthened across town. Henry mounted his paint, treaty secure in his coat. Other riders and wagons began the journey home, spirits high with victory. As they started down the road toward Kim's farm, Noel's scout-trained eyes caught movement along the ridgeline. Dark shapes moved between pine trees, following their path. He counted at least 4 mounted men. Noel touched his arm where the silver had emerged, remembering providence. Whatever trouble those shadows promised, they would face it together. But for now, he kept silent, letting Kim and the children savor their hard-won hope as dusk painted. The mountains purple and gold. The wagon wheels creaked softly as they pulled up to Kim's farmhouse in the deepening twilight. Noel helped the children down while Kim lit the porch lantern, its warm glow pushing back the gathering darkness. The barn dog, Bruno, trotted over to sniff their boots, tail wagging in welcome. Best I stay tonight, Noel said quietly to Kim, glancing toward the shadowed ridge. Just to be certain all's well. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. The children would like that. Inside, Kim's daughter Sarah stoked the cook stove while her brothers, Thomas and James, set the table with their mother's few pieces of good china. The familiar scent of baking cornbread filled the small kitchen, mixing with the sharp pine smell of fresh split kindling in the wood box. Uncle Noel's staying, Sarah announced, her face brightening as she arranged the plates. The word uncle caught him off guard, stirring memories of happier times before the accident, before his brother's death had carved such distance between them all. He hung his coat by the door, beside the children's worn jackets. Kim pulled a stew pot from the oven, the savory aroma making stomachs growl. It ain't much, she apologized, but there's plenty to share. Smells like heaven, Noel said truthfully. After years of solitary meals in his line shack, the simple act of gathering around a family table felt like a forgotten blessing. They joined hands for grace, Kim's soft voice giving thanks for the day's victory and the food before them. The children's amen came eager and quick, making the adults smile. As they passed the bowls around, Thomas looked up at Noel with bright eyes. "Tell us about living in the mountains, Uncle Noel. Do you really track bears?" "Now, Thomas, let your uncle eat," Kim chided gently. "No harm in stories," Noel said, settling back in his chair. The stew was hot and filling, better than anything he'd cooked for himself in years. "Well now, just last spring I came across a grizzly print big as a dinner plate." The children leaned forward, spoons forgotten, as Noel described following the bear's trail through spring snow, reading signs of its passing in broken branches and scratched bark. He kept the tale mild enough for young ears, focusing on the bear's clever ways of finding food and the respect a mountain man must show such creatures. "Did you shoot it?" James asked, eyes wide. Noel shook his head. "No need. Bears generally leave folks alone if you're wise enough to leave them be. Sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when not to fight." Kim's glance showed she caught his deeper meaning. The railroad men were like bears themselves, best handled with caution and respect for their power. More stories followed as they finished supper. Noel described the peace of alpine meadows filled with columbine, the way bighorn sheep seemed to dance along sheer cliffs, the morning song of thrushes echoing through spruce forests. The children drank in every word, their usual mealtime fidgets forgotten. When the dishes were cleared and washed, Sarah brought out her mother's worn Bible. It was their nightly ritual, Kim explained softly, started after their father died. They gathered close around the fireplace, lamplight gleaming on eager faces as Noel read the familiar words of Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." The ancient promises of protection and provision felt especially powerful after the day's events. Kim's eyes grew misty as Noel's deep voice filled the room. When he finished, the children begged for one more story before bed. "Just a short one," Kim agreed, seeing their heavy eyelids despite their protests. Noel told them about a mother fox he'd once watched teaching her kits to hunt, how she'd shown such patience as they learned to stalk and pounce. By the time he finished, Sarah was yawning, and James had nodded off against his sister's shoulder. Kim shooed them upstairs to bed, their sleepy goodnights and hugs warming something long frozen in Noel's heart. He found himself missing these simple family moments he'd denied himself during his years of solitude. When she came back downstairs, Kim added wood to the fire and settled into the rocking chair her husband had made. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance. "I owe you an apology," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. "After John died, I blamed you for not being there. Thought if you'd been working the mine that day instead of off in the mountains, maybe things would have been different." Noel stared into the fire, the old guilt rising. "Not a day goes by I don't wish I'd been there. I know that now." Kim's hands worked steadily at her mending. "Took me years to see past my own grief. To understand you carried wounds just as deep as mine." He touched his scarred arm unconsciously. "The collapse that buried me, it changed something inside. Couldn't go back underground after that. Felt like a coward, running to the mountains." "You weren't running," Kim said firmly. "You were surviving. Same as me, same as the children. We all carry our scars differently." The firelight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, reminding Noel how the years had marked them both. He started to respond, but a low growl from outside cut him short. Bruno's warning rumble grew louder, followed by the scrape of boots on gravel. Noel was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the lantern from its hook. "Stay inside," he told Kim quietly. "Lock the door behind me." The night air bit cold as he stepped onto the porch holding the lantern high. Bruno stood rigid by the barn, hackles raised, staring into the darkness beyond the house. Noel moved carefully down the steps, scanning the shadows between buildings. The dog's growl faded to whimpers as Noel approached. Whatever had disturbed Bruno was gone now, but the night felt wrong somehow. Too still. He made a slow circuit of the house and barn, checking doors and windows, finding nothing obviously amiss. Still, unease prickled along his spine. The ridge where he'd spotted the riders earlier loomed black against the star-filled sky. Watching. Waiting. When he returned inside, Kim stood by. The fireplace, a poker gripped tight in her hand. "Nothing to see," he reported, though they both knew that meant little. "But I'll bed down in the barn loft tonight. Keep watch." She nodded, relief and worry warring in her expression. "There's extra blankets in the chest? And Noel?" She touched his arm briefly. "Thank you. For everything." He gathered the blankets and his rifle, then made his way to the barn. The familiar smells of hay and horses helped ease his tension somewhat. Above in the loft, he arranged a comfortable spot near the window where he could watch both the house and the road. The hours crept by. An owl called. Mice rustled in the hay below. Bruno made his rounds, pausing occasionally to sniff the air. Noel dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every unusual sound. The deep quiet before dawn was shattered by sudden hoofbeats. Multiple riders, moving fast, thundering past the farm and away toward town. Bruno's warning bark came too late. Noel rose quickly, cold dread settling in his stomach. The riders had waited until the darkest hour, when even the most vigilant eyes grew heavy. But for what purpose? He stood at the loft window, straining to see through the pre-dawn gloom, counting the minutes until first light would reveal what the night riders had done. The first hint of dawn filtered through the loft window, painting the barn boards in pale gray light. Noel shifted from his watch post, muscles stiff from the long night. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. The tobacco tin with its silver shard pressed against his chest, a constant reminder of what had brought them to this moment. A strange scent caught his attention. Not the usual morning smells of dew and hay, but something sharper, acrid. His eyes snapped fully open as recognition hit him. Smoke. He scrambled to the loft window. Orange flames were already consuming the far edge of Kim's wheat field, racing through the dry winter stalks. Dark figures on horseback melted away into the pre-dawn shadows, their work done. The railroad's revenge had come with the sunrise. "Fire!" Noel's shout tore through the quiet morning. He grabbed his coat and practically flew down the loft ladder. "Kim!" Fire in the fields. The farmhouse door burst open. Kim emerged in her nightdress, face draining of color as she saw the wall of flames advancing toward them. Behind her, the children appeared, Sarah clutching her younger brother's hands. "Thomas, run to the neighbors. James, Sarah, get the buckets." Kim's voice cracked but held steady as she issued commands. The eldest boy took off running while his siblings raced for the well. Noel was already working the pump handle, muscles straining as he filled the first bucket. The flames roared closer, fed by the morning breeze. His heart pounded with desperate rhythm as he passed full buckets to Kim and the children, knowing even as they fought that it was hopeless. The fire was too big, spreading too fast. "The barn!" Kim cried suddenly. "The horses!" Noel spun to see flames licking up the barn's rear wall where the raiders had set a second blaze. He sprinted for the hut building, throwing open the doors. Smoke billowed out as he rushed inside. The horses screamed in terror, kicking at their stalls. He worked quickly to free them, dodging hooves as the panicked animals bolted for safety. The roof timbers groaned ominously. Noel coughed in the thickening smoke, eyes streaming as he did a final check for animals. That's when he heard it, a small whimper from the tack room. "James," he called out, horror clenching his gut. The boy must have run in to save his father's old saddle. Following the sound, Noel found James crouched in the corner, clutching the worn leather saddle to his chest. The boy's eyes were wide with fear as smoke swirled around them. "Can't breathe," James gasped. Noel scooped him up, saddle and all, and staggered toward the door. A burning beam crashed behind them, showering sparks. The boy went limp in his arms. Noel tucked James's face against his coat and ran. They burst out into the morning air as the barn roof collapsed in a shower of flaming debris. Kim's scream pierced the chaos as she saw her unconscious son. Noel laid James gently on the ground, checking for breath. The boy's chest barely moved. "Breathe, son," Noel commanded, turning James onto his side and patting his back firmly. "Breathe!" James convulsed suddenly, coughing violently. Each harsh breath seemed to tear from his lungs, but he was breathing. Kim gathered him into her arms, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. More shouts rang out as neighbors finally arrived, but it was far too late. The barn was completely engulfed, and the flames had devoured most of the wheat field. They formed a bucket line anyway, working to keep the fire from spreading to the house and nearby woods. By midday, the last flames sputtered out, leaving behind a hellscape of ash and char. The barn was nothing but smoldering timbers. The wheat field, Kim's hope for winter survival, lay in ruins. Even the well house had partially burned, its roof a blackened skeleton against the sky. Noel stood in the middle of the destruction, clothes and skin stained with soot, lungs raw from smoke. The silver shard seemed to burn against his chest like a brand of guilt. If he hadn't come down from his mountain with that cursed piece of ore, none of this would have happened. Kim and her children would still have their livelihood, their safety. He watched Kim comfort Sarah, who sobbed inconsolably over her ruined garden. The little plot where she'd tended winter vegetables was trampled and scorched, the careful rows obliterated by horses' hooves. Thomas stood silent nearby, looking far older than his 12 years as he surveyed their losses. James lay on a neighbor's blanket, still coughing weakly, the precious saddle clutched to his chest. "We'll rebuild," Kim said firmly, though her voice shook. "We still have the house. We still have each other." But Noel could see the fear behind her brave words. Winter was coming. Without the wheat crop, without stored vegetables, without the barn's protection for livestock, how would they survive? The neighbors helped clear. What debris they could offered what comfort they could. As sunset painted the smoke-filled sky in shades of blood and gold, Kim's closest friend Martha brought them a loaf of bread, all she could spare from her own slim stores. They gathered that night in the kitchen, which had escaped major damage. The house felt wrong. Too quiet, except for James's occasional coughing, too empty with their possessions moved away from scorched walls. They broke the bread and ate in silence, no one having the heart for grace. Sarah hiccuped softly, trying to hold back fresh tears. Thomas stared at his plate, jaw clenched tight. James lay on a pallet near the stove, finally sleeping, his father's saddle still within reach. Kim moved mechanically, tending to her children with gentle hands that trembled slightly. Noel couldn't bear to eat. The bread turned to ashes in his mouth, bitter with guilt. He'd brought this down on them. His silver, his defiance of the railroad, his failure to keep proper watch. The warmth of family he'd felt just yesterday seemed like a cruel joke now. When the children were settled for the night, huddled together in the parlor away from damaged walls, Noel took his blanket to the front porch. He couldn't leave them unprotected, but he couldn't face sleeping under the roof he'd helped endanger. Kim followed him out. "This isn't your fault," she said quietly. "Isn't it?" He gestured at the devastation silvered by moonlight. "I should have known they'd retaliate. Should have posted better watch. Should never have brought that cursed silver here." "The railroad men did this," Kim said firmly. "Not you. Not the silver. Them and their greed." She touched his arm lightly. "We knew the risk when we chose to fight." But her words couldn't penetrate the wall of shame surrounding him. Noel waited until she went inside, then climbed onto the porch roof. He lay there studying the stars through wisps of lingering smoke, remembering the hope they'd felt just yesterday in the courthouse. Now that hope lay as ruined as the barn's ashes scattered by the cruel winds of reality. The silver shard pressed against his ribs, a constant reminder of his role in this disaster. He wanted to hurl it away into the darkness, but even that wouldn't undo the damage. Wouldn't fill empty bellies or rebuild burned walls. Wouldn't erase the terror in James's eyes as smoke filled his lungs. Sleep eluded him completely. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw flames leaping skyward, heard children screaming, smelled the acrid stench of dreams burning. The night stretched endless, broken only by James's muffled coughing from below and the occasional sob from Sarah. Noel stared at the charred rafters of the ruined barn silhouetted against the stars. Shame and guilt crashed over him in waves, threatening to drown him in their dark waters. He had thought God sent the silver as provision, as a miracle of healing. Instead, it had brought only destruction to those he was beginning to love as family once again. The moon tracked slowly across the sky as Noel kept his lonely vigil, watching for more riders, though he knew they wouldn't return. They'd accomplished their goal, breaking not just the land, but the spirit of those who dared to stand against them. As false dawn began to pale the eastern sky, he heard Kim moving about below, starting another day despite their losses. Her quiet strength only deepened his shame. She had survived her husband's death, raised 3 children alone, fought to keep her farm alive, and now his presence had brought ruin to all she'd built. The silver shard seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, a physical weight of guilt pressing against his heart, as surely as it pressed against his chest. Noel remained motionless on the roof, drowning in shame as the sun began to rise on their shattered hopes. Morning brought a steady stream of neighbors to Kim's farm. They came with covered dishes and sympathetic faces, gathering in small groups around the charred ruins. The acrid smell of wet ash still hung in the air, mixing with the aroma of Martha's apple pie and Sarah Jensen's corn pudding. Noel stood apart, watching through red-rimmed eyes as the women fussed over Kim and her children. He hadn't slept at all, the weight of guilt pressing heavier with each passing hour. James's cough echoed from inside the house, a constant reminder of how close they'd come to losing him. "Such a shame," Mrs. Peterson whispered to her husband, not realizing Noel could hear. But what did they expect going up against the railroad like that? "Foolishness," her husband agreed, shaking his head. "Pure foolishness. Railroad's too powerful to fight." "Those poor children," another woman murmured. "First their father, now this. They should have just sold out when they had the chance." Each whispered comment drove the knife of shame deeper into Noel's heart. He watched Thomas trying to salvage tools from the barn ruins, the boy's shoulders stiff with adult worry. Sarah sat listlessly on the porch steps, not touching the piece of pie someone had brought her. Even the usually chattering neighbors fell silent when they passed the scorched wheat field, its blackened stalks stretching toward the cold autumn sky like accusing fingers. Reverend Sims arrived mid-morning, his wagon loaded with blankets and supplies. He spoke quietly with Kim while helping to board up a scorched section of wall. When he approached Noel, concern etched on his weathered face, Noel couldn't bear the kindness in the older man's eyes. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, son," the preacher began. "Does he?" Noel's voice came out harsh. "Seems pretty clear to me. I brought this down on them." He turned away before Reverend Sims could respond, striding toward the stable where Patch was kept. The old mule lifted his head at Noel's approach, ears twitching forward expectantly. Without allowing himself to think too deeply about what he was doing, Noel began saddling him. The familiar motions felt like a betrayal. Each buckle he fastened, each strap he tightened, seemed to whisper coward. But he couldn't stay, couldn't keep watching the destruction his presence had caused. The mountains called. To him, promising solitude, promising an escape from the weight of others' suffering. He was checking the cinch when Kim's voice cut through his thoughts like a whip. Running away again? Noel turned to find her standing in the stable doorway, arms crossed. Anger blazed in her eyes, but beneath it he saw something worse. Disappointment. "You'll be safer without me here," he said, not meeting her gaze. "All of you will." "Safer?" Kim's laugh held no humor. "The railroad won't stop just because you leave. They'll keep pushing, keep taking, until there's nothing left. Running will doom us all." "Everything I touch turns to ash," Noel snapped, his guilt finding voice in anger. "My brother died because I wasn't there. Now your farm burns because I was. You'll be better off without my curse." "Curse?" Kim stepped forward, her voice rising. "That silver was a gift, a way to fight back, to save not just my farm, but others too. but you're too wrapped in self-pity to see it." Her words struck like physical blows. Noel swung up into the saddle, needing to escape before she could voice more truths he couldn't bear to hear. "Your brother would be ashamed," Kim said softly as he turned Patch toward the door. Noel kicked the mule into motion, nearly running down Reverend Sims in his haste to flee. He heard Kim call out once more but didn't slow, didn't look back. The sound of James coughing followed him down the lane, each harsh bark another accusation. He rode hard into the foothills, pushing Patch faster than the old mule should go. The November wind bit through his coat, but he welcomed the cold. It matched the ice forming around his heart. When the mule finally began to labor, Noel let him slow to a walk. They followed a frozen creek up into the pine forest. Ice rimmed the slow-moving water, and what leaves remained on the aspens rattled like dry bones in the wind. It was a good place to be alone, to nurse his shame in private. Noel dismounted near a fallen log, letting Patch graze on what sparse grass remained. Silver shard pressed against his chest, a constant reminder of his failures. He pulled it out, studying how it caught the weak sunlight. "Why?" he asked aloud, his voice harsh in the forest silence. "Why send this if you meant it for destruction? Was it just to punish me? Wasn't being buried alive enough?" Only the wind answered, soughing through the pines. Noel's bitter prayers rose like smoke into the gray sky, but no peace descended. The silence felt heavy, accusing. Even the familiar mountains seemed to turn their backs on him. "I thought it was a miracle," he continued, his voice breaking. "Thought you were showing me a way to help them. Instead, I brought them nothing but pain." He drew back his arm, ready to hurl the silver shard into the creek. Let the ice take it, bury it until spring. Let it be forgotten like all his other failures. But James's face flashed in his memory. The boy's joy when Noel had told him stories, his trust when asking for help with chores. Sarah's shy smile when he'd admired her garden. Thomas's quiet pride when Noel had praised. His fence mending. Kim's fierce determination to save her children's future. His arm dropped. Throwing away the silver wouldn't undo what had happened. It wouldn't rebuild the barn or restore the wheat field. It wouldn't heal the breach of trust or ease the burden of guilt. As the sun sank toward the western peaks, Noel gathered firewood with mechanical motions. The routine of making camp should have been comforting. It was what he'd done alone for years. But now the solitude pressed in around him like a physical weight. No children's laughter brightened the dusk. No smell of Kim's cornbread wafted on the wind. Even Patch seemed subdued, standing with head lowered instead of nosing hopefully through Noel's saddlebags for treats. The small fire cast more shadows than light. Noel huddled close to it, his back against a pine trunk, and tried to convince himself he'd made the right choice. The mountain silence that had once felt like peace now echoed with accusations. Each snap of the flames reminded him of the barn burning. Each gust of wind carried phantom sounds of children crying. He drew out his Bible, more from habit than hope, but couldn't bring himself to open it. What comfort could he find there? He'd thought the silver was an answer to prayer, a miracle of healing. Instead, it had brought only destruction to those who had dared to trust him. The stars emerged one by one, cold and distant as God's mercy seemed to be. Noel wrapped himself in his blanket, but nothing could warm the chill in his soul. The night stretched endless before him, promising no rest, no peace, no answers to his bitter questions. He was alone again, just as he'd been after the mine collapse. But this time, the solitude felt less like sanctuary and more like punishment. The silence of the pines weighed heavy on his shoulders, a burden far heavier than any silver shard. The moon rose, casting sharp shadows through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a sound of loneliness that echoed in Noel's heart. He fed another stick to the dying fire and settled in for another sleepless night, haunted by the faces of those he'd left behind. Kim stood at her farmhouse window, watching the late afternoon shadows stretch across the charred remains of her wheat field. The acrid smell of smoke still clung to everything, a constant reminder of all they'd lost. Behind her, the children worked quietly at the rough-hewn table, Sarah helping James with his letters while Thomas mended a torn shirt. "Mama?" Sarah's small voice broke the silence. "Will Mr. Noel come back?" Kim's throat tightened. She turned from the window, forcing a smile. "He needs time to think, sweetheart. Sometimes grown folks need that." "But he promised to teach me more about tracking deer," Thomas said, looking up from his mending. The disappointment in his eyes made Kim's heart ache. "And he was going to read more Bible stories," James added, coughing slightly. The smoke had affected his chest worst of all. Kim crossed to the hearth, adding another piece of precious firewood. The house felt colder without Noel's steady presence, without his quiet way of fixing things and making the children laugh. But she couldn't let them see her own doubts. "Let's focus on what we can do today," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Those spelling words won't learn themselves." A knock at the door startled them all. Kim's hand trembled slightly as she lifted the latch, but it was Henry who stood there, a dressed deer across his shoulders. "Thought you might need this?" he said simply, stepping inside. His dark eyes took in the children's drawn faces, the patched walls, the meager fire. "Henry." Thomas jumped up, his face brightening. "Did you track it far? What signs did you follow?" Henry's grave expression softened as he set down his burden. "Come help me dress it properly, and I'll show you how to read the signs next time." While Thomas helped Henry with the venison, Kim noticed the scout had brought more than just meat. Tools were strapped to his horse outside, and rough-cut shingles lay across his saddle. "The roof," Henry said, following her gaze. "There's damage from the fire that needs mending before the next storm." Kim blinked back sudden tears. "You don't have to." "We are allies now," Henry interrupted quietly. "More than that. We are neighbors on this land. The Ute way is to help those in need, especially in winter." The afternoon passed in steady work. Henry and Thomas repaired the roof while Kim and Sarah prepared the venison. James sat wrapped in a blanket, reading aloud from the family Bible. The familiar words brought both comfort and pain, reminding Kim of Noel, reading to them just days ago. As dusk approached, Henry paused in his work, looking toward the mountains. Snow clouds were gathering, thick and gray. "Storm's coming," he said. "A bad one." His tone held worry that Kim knew wasn't just about weather. "He'll freeze up there alone," she whispered, following Henry's gaze. Henry nodded slowly. "The mountain can be cruel to a man with a troubled spirit. But Noel Boone knows these peaks better than most. And sometimes—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes a man must walk into the storm to find his way home." Later, after Henry had gone and the children were fed, Kim gathered them for evening prayers. They knelt together by the hearth, its weak light casting long shadows on the wall. "Dear Lord," Kim began, her voice steady despite her heart's turmoil, "watch over us in our need. Protect those we love, especially—" She faltered slightly. "Especially Mr. Noel," Sarah finished firmly, her small hand squeezing Kim's. "Please bring him back," Thomas added. "And keep him warm," James whispered, coughing again. Kim closed her eyes tight against tears. "Lord, guide him through whatever storm he's facing. Help him remember he's not alone. Give him the courage to return to those who—" She swallowed hard. "Those who need him." High in the mountains, Noel huddled against a fallen log as the first snowflakes began to fall. He'd made a rough camp, more from habit than care, but sleep eluded him. The wind had shifted suddenly after sunset, bringing with it the bitter cold of an early winter storm. Patch stamped uneasily, steam rising from his flanks. Noel had covered the old mule with his spare blanket, knowing they'd both need all their strength to survive what was coming. Already the snow was falling faster, thick flakes that stuck to everything they touched. A sudden gust of wind brought a sound that made Noel's heart clench. Children's laughter, carried on the storm. He knew it was just his mind playing tricks, but it sounded so real. Sarah's high giggle, Thomas's deeper chuckle, James's quiet mirth. He remembered them gathered around the table, faces bright in lamplight as he told stories of mountain life. Remembered the trust in their eyes, the way they'd looked to him for protection when the flames threatened, the way they'd called him family without even meaning to. The wind rose higher, howling through the pines. Snow drove sideways now, finding every gap in Noel's coat. He pulled out the silver shard, its surface dark in the stormy night. What had seemed like a curse now felt different, not a punishment, but a test, not of his strength, but of his heart. "I've been a fool," he whispered, words snatched away by the wind. "Running from your blessing instead of seeing its purpose." Another memory came, sharp as the driving snow. Kim's voice raised in the evening prayer, teaching her children to trust in something bigger than their fears. She'd never lost faith, not through her husband's death, not through years of struggling alone, not even when flames took her harvest. The storm grew fiercer as night deepened. Noel worked constantly to keep his small fire alive, knowing it meant the difference between life and death. Patch huddled close, sharing what warmth they could. The old mule's loyalty shamed him. Even animals knew better than to abandon those who depended on them. By midnight, the world had vanished in swirling white. Noel's hands were numb despite his gloves, his face raw from the wind. Each breath felt like swallowing ice. He thought of Kim's farmhouse, how the damaged roof would let in the cold, of James's weak chest, still healing from smoke, of Henry's warnings about the railroad men who might take advantage of the storm to cause more mischief. Dawn seemed an eternity away. Noel fought to stay awake, knowing sleep in such cold meant death. To keep his mind sharp, he recited psalms from memory, verses his mother had taught him, verses he'd heard Kim's children practice. Words of trust in the darkest valley, of strength renewed like eagles, of help coming from the mountains. When the eastern sky finally began to lighten, the storm showed no sign of weakening. But something had changed in Noel's heart. The darkness that had driven him to flee had been scoured away by wind and snow and memories of children's prayers. He struggled to his feet, every muscle protesting. Patch looked at him with doubtful eyes as he began breaking camp. "Can't stay here, old friend," Noel said, his voice rough from cold. "Got people counting on us, whether they should or not." The mule's ears pricked forward at his tone. Despite exhaustion, despite the raging storm, they both knew the way home. It lay down in the valley, where a farmhouse waited with broken roof and wounded hearts, where children prayed by firelight, where allies stood strong against injustice. Noel mounted carefully, the silver shard warm against his chest, despite the cold. He turned Patch's head toward the valley, toward Kim and her children, toward the fight he'd been wrong to abandon. "Lord," he prayed as they started down the treacherous slope, "guide us home, and give me strength to make things right." The storm raged on, but Noel Boone and his faithful mule pushed forward, one step at a time, leaving the cold solitude of the mountains behind. Far below, though he couldn't see it through the swirling snow, a farmhouse waited, and in it, a family prayed for his return. The morning sun had barely crested the hills when Noel's mule stumbled into Kim's farmyard. Frost sparkled on his beard, and his clothes were stiff with ice. The front door burst open as Kim's children spilled out into the yard. "Mr. Noel! Mr. Noel!" Sarah called, running toward him through the fresh snow. Thomas and James followed close behind, their faces bright with relief. Noel nearly fell from the saddle, his limbs wooden from cold. Thomas caught his arm, steadying him as he dismounted. "Let's get you warm," Kim said, from the doorway, her voice gentle. "James, take care of Mr. Noel's mule." Inside, the farmhouse kitchen was warm and bright. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air as Kim set a steaming plate before him. Noel's hands shook as he wrapped them around a tin cup of coffee. "Kim, he began, his voice rough. "I'm sorry for running. I thought I was protecting you all, but I was just being a coward." Kim sat across from him, her eyes soft. "Sometimes God allows wounds so light can pour through," she said quietly. "Like that silver in your arm. What looks like a curse might be His way of giving us strength for the fight ahead." Henry arrived as they finished breakfast, stamping snow from his boots. He nodded at Noel, approval clear in his eyes. "The town needs to see the truth," Henry said, spreading a worn map on the table. "We'll gather everyone at the church. Show them the treaty, the railroad's lies, your silver claim. Let them choose which side of justice they stand on." The children cleared the breakfast dishes as the adults planned. By early afternoon, they were ready. Noel felt strange riding into town beside Kim and Henry, not sneaking in alone like before, but walking openly into the fight. The scar on his arm ached in the cold, a reminder of God's mysterious ways. That silver shard had brought him back to family, to purpose, to faith. Now it would help bring justice. As they rode down Main Street, Noel noticed changes. Shopkeepers nodded as they passed. Miners touched their hats in greeting. A group of farmers gathered outside the general store gave them encouraging smiles. Henry posted meeting notices while Kim spoke with the preacher. Noel caught sight of railroad men watching from the saloon, their faces dark with anger, but he held his head high, no longer afraid. By evening, posters covered the town. Public meeting, railroad land claims, justice for all. People stopped to read them, gathering in small groups to talk. Even the sheriff paused to study one, thoughtfully stroking his mustache. "Look there," Kim whispered, touching Noel's arm. More townsfolk were approaching, offering quiet words of support. The isolation that had haunted them all was breaking. The church pews creaked under the weight of so many bodies. Every seat was taken, with folks standing along the walls and spilling out the door into the cold night air. Lamplight flickered across worried faces as Noel, Kim, and Henry stood before the gathering. Noel's heart hammered in his chest as he stepped forward. The silver shard felt heavy in his pocket, like a stone of judgment. He pulled it out, holding it up so it caught the lamplight. "This piece of silver came out of my own flesh," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "At first I thought it was God's gift to me alone. But now I see it different." He paused, looking across the sea of faces. "I'm surrendering my claim to this silver. No amount of wealth is worth more than your homes, your children's future, or the dignity of the Ute people whose land this truly is." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a hymnal with a thud. In the back, railroad men shifted angrily, their faces dark with contempt. Kim stepped forward, her worn shawl wrapped tight against the evening chill. "We're not just fighting for land," she said softly, but her voice carried to every corner. "We're fighting for family, for faith, for the courage to stand together when it would be easier to stand alone." Henry moved to join them, his bearing proud but gentle. "If these treaties fall here," he said, "they'll fall everywhere. Your children will learn that promises mean nothing. Is that the legacy you want to leave?" Silence filled the church. Then old Tom Weber, who'd farmed the valley 40 years, stood up slowly. "I'm with you," he said firmly. Like a wave, others began rising. Sarah Miller, whose husband died in the mines. Young Jenkins from the general store. The Cooper brothers who ran the livery. One by one they stood, voices growing stronger as they pledged support. The railroad men stormed out, boots thundering on the wooden steps. But nobody followed them. Reverend Sims raised his hands for prayer. "Lord," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "give us strength to stand for what's right." "Amen," the crowd responded, the sound swelling like a chorus. Noel felt Kim's hand slip into his, warm and strong. Henry nodded at them both, a smile touching his eyes. Looking out at the united faces of miners, farmers, and townsfolk, Noel felt something he hadn't known in years: hope. Not just for himself, but for the whole valley. The church rafters seemed to ring with the power of their shared purpose as neighbors clasped hands and shared determined looks. What had started with a mysterious silver shard was growing into something far more precious. Community dawn painted the main street golden as Noel, Kim, and Henry walked shoulder to shoulder toward the land office. The railroad lawyer stood on the boardwalk, flanked by 4 hired guns, their hands resting on their holsters. "Your threats won't work anymore," Noel called out, his voice carrying across the quiet street. Kim squeezed his hand, her fingers trembling but determined. Behind them, boots scraped on wooden planks as townsfolk emerged from shops and doorways. Tom Weber planted himself firmly behind the trio, followed by the Cooper brothers and a dozen miners. More people joined with each passing moment until the street filled with grim-faced supporters. "I'm withdrawing my silver claim," Noel announced clearly. "But the Ute Treaty stands. These good people won't let you steal their land." "Honor the treaty," someone shouted from the crowd. Others took up the cry until it echoed off the buildings. "Honor the treaty! Honor the treaty!" The lawyer's face twisted with rage, but his eyes darted nervously at the growing crowd. His hired men shifted uneasily, outnumbered 20 to 1. "This isn't over," the lawyer spat. But he gestured to his men. They backed away, mounted their horses, and rode out of town in a cloud of dust. Relief washed over the street. Kim's eyes filled with tears as she gripped Noel's hand. Henry's slight smile acknowledged their victory, hard-won but real. As evening approached, warm lamplight began glowing in windows throughout the town, like beacons of renewed hope. Spring's gentle warmth crept into the valley, melting winter's grip day by day. The sound of hammers rang through the crisp morning air as neighbors gathered to rebuild Kim's barn. Reverend Sims led the workers in amazing grace while they hoisted fresh-cut timbers into place. Noel worked alongside the other men, his muscles aching but his heart light. Kim's children darted between the workers, carrying nails and tools, their faces bright with excitement. The youngest boy tugged at Noel's sleeve, proudly showing him a wooden peg he'd whittled. Henry rode in on his pinto, dismounting with news that brought smiles all around. "Word from Washington," he announced. "They'll honor the treaty, at least for now." The workers paused to cheer, then returned to their task with renewed vigor. As evening settled, Kim served up hearty stew and fresh bread to the tired workers. Around her table, laughter and storytelling filled the warm air. After the meal, Noel stepped out onto the porch, studying the silver scar on his arm in the starlight. What he'd once cursed as his burden had become God's instrument of healing. He felt Kim's presence before he saw her. She slipped her hand into his, and they stood together in comfortable silence. From the church in town, the evening bells rang out their hymn, while behind them, the children's gleeful giggles spilled through the open door like music. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.